I'm Johnny Buchanan. Now, are you sitting comfortably? I asked that question because what we're going to do in this video is we're going to go back to school a little bit in terms of understanding a really important thing when it comes to volume. So this is going to be one of those videos where we're focusing on making sure that you, having worked as hard as you can to make amazing music, and you're at the point where you want to put it out into the world, you're not being unfairly disadvantaged by the way that you have managed volume within your track. To explain what I mean, we're going to listen to this live loop session that I've turned into a track, which by the way means it's going to get a copyright strike because there are people in the world who have claimed this content of their own. It's not their own. You'll find this music in the live loop sessions. I think this one is called Neon Dreams. Certainly all of the audio files that have been generated from it are called Neon Dreams, so I think that's a fair bet. It sounds like this. Get your disco shoes on. Okay, now I've deliberately made quite a long section of this track because we're going to need quite a long section of this track to fully understand what this video is going to be about, which is about the volume understanding of what LUFS are and why they're absolutely imperative if what you want to do is to upload your music to places like Apple Music, to places like Spotify, and to a number of other places where your music might end up being streamed. Because, let's get into the details right away, in order to ensure that when people are listening to music on playlists that either they've created themselves or when those recommendations just flow from maybe a track that you've decided to listen to on Spotify or Apple Music, and then the algorithm determines what might come next in your playlist. The last thing it wants you doing is constantly reaching for your volume dial to turn up songs that are really quiet and to turn down the volume of things that are really loud. And the same thing is true if you're watching television, that actually what we don't want is to be constantly reaching for the volume dial. And actually when you think about the range of things that you might potentially flick through if you were channel surfing, the idea that you might go from, I don't know, some enormous battle in space to an incredibly quiet nature documentary, and the kind of volume balance between those two things actually is not as wide as you might expect, because the level of broadcast is managed to ensure that things are never too quiet and never too loud. So that if you turn up the volume on the nature documentary, decide that you're slightly bored of the marmosets and decide to go and watch the space battle instead, you don't blow out your TV speakers, your hearing, and annoy your neighbours. So in other words, volume is managed in all kinds of places where we access it, whether we're listening to music, watching television, going to the cinema, all those kinds of things. And with that in mind, there is a measurement that is used by those services which we refer to as LUFS, Loudness Units per Full Scale. What that means literally is the average volume which is applied to every single track, or where every track is adjusted to ensure that it conforms to the volume over the whole of one of those services as it provides volume to you. Now then, I'm going to show you something. When I turn on Mastering Assistant within this channel, what's going to happen, as we know, because I've made videos about Mastering Assistant, is that Logic is going to configure what it considers to be a kind of appropriate mastering solution to the track that it's just analysed in real time as I've turned that on. And we've got EQ over here on the left. I've got the opportunity to dial in some additional stereo width, and it determines that I could use use some of that in this particular track. I wonder what Studio 54 would have to say about that. And what I've also got is a chance to sort of dial in extra loudness. And of course I'm going to reach for that because I've been mixing all day long. I want the kind of energy hit that comes from extra loudness. For goodness sake, I only have to push one dial and everything is going to get louder. Why on earth wouldn't I do that? Interestingly, over on the right-hand side, next to dynamics and indeed next to spread, we've got a number of different metering things that are built into these controls. I've got true peak metering here. I've got LUFS metering here. I've just mentioned those. And I've got phase correlation down here. Now, in other videos, I'm going to look at some of the other metering options that exist within Logic. What we're interested in today is just LUFS and ways of measuring loudness. So what I'm going to do now is to press play again. We won't listen to the whole track this time. Sorry, you can take off one of your disco shoes, but have it ready, we're going to need it again. But what we should find is that now things are louder because, of course, this track has now been mastered. Simple as that. One plugin to do all of that for you. Useful, isn't it? Okay, so we can now hear that it's louder. By the way, I was being facetious before. This is not a substitute for the full mastering process. I'll say that every time I talk about Mastering Assistant. Now then, we have got the idea of metering within this plugin, and that's useful. But what we're actually going to do is to go to Logic's dedicated meters. Now, these exist in a folder of their own, which is called appropriately metering. And what I'm particularly interested in is the Loudness Meter. And this is simply a nice little skinny, not terribly wide thing. It looks like a kind of 500 series module. Sorry, I'm getting a bit techie now. But we've got this nice little Loudness Meter, and its job is to measure LUFS. Loudness Units Full Scale is what those letters stand for. Now then, what I have a chance to do before anything else happens is to set the LUFS level at the point at which I want to measure it. What on earth does that mean? Well, let's suppose I wanted to upload my music to Spotify. It turns out that the LUFS level for Spotify in 2025, when I'm making this video, is at minus 14 decibels. In other words, every single piece of music on Spotify cannot exceed that number. If I upload a track which does exceed that number to Spotify, Spotify's algorithm will turn its volume down. It will just make it quieter. Similarly, if I make a track which is quieter than that, it might elevate that volume up to minus 14. But the really crucial thing for you to know is that rather than that just being an absolute line in the sand, LUFS measurements on Spotify and other streaming services are about the volume over time. In other words, from the moment your track starts until the moment it ends. And that's going to be a really important piece of information when it comes to understanding how we can make our tracks feel nice and loud on those streaming services rather than sounding really clipped and quiet and much quieter than everybody else's tracks. Now, to understand what LUFS mean, what I've done, or what has happened by default, is that I'm in a position to set the loudness scale at the level that I like. And the reason why this is variable is because different platforms use different output volumes. So for example, Apple Music at the moment is at minus 16 dB. We're going to come back up into Spotify land at minus 14. Now what that means is, having set that line there, anything that exceeds that volume will show up as a little yellow bar above that line, showing me that that particular point in the track is too loud, and therefore if I was to upload the track in its current form to that streaming platform, its volume would be lost. So that's what we're doing. We're kind of setting that level. And what we're going to do is to then take the track back to the beginning. And what I'm going to do is to press start. Now I'm going to do that. We're going to watch this through, and then I'm going to explain what M, S, and I stand for. But let's get some measurements first. Here is start. Let's press play. Okay, I'm going to stop there for a moment. And in fact, I haven't pressed stop, so we're still actually measuring one of these things, which is what's referred to as our integrated LUFS measurement. Okay, so what we have is an opportunity to look at volume in 3 different ways. Firstly, we can look at it in a momentary way. This is effectively the shortest term version of measuring volume. And that number, you'll have noticed, is incredibly twitchy. I'm going to do this again in a minute so you can watch it back. And what you'll find is that is constantly sort of reading the volume at any given moment in time. It's almost like a true peak measurement. It's effectively constantly looking at the loudest moment of volume. What we then have is a short-term measurement. Now, different loudness meters measure short-term in a slightly different way. So that might be anything from half a second up to 2 seconds. It's rather than the actual sort of peak of the wave, which is what we're getting from the momentary measurement, this is a slightly more, you know what, I'm not going to just measure every single peak, every transient. I'm interested in taking a kind of average volume, but still over a relatively short period of time. And then we have the integrated LUFS measurement. And this is the one that matters when it comes to streaming services. And what it's doing is it's looking at the volume from the first moment of your track all the way to the last one. And it's that one that counts when it comes to streaming services. Now, why am I laboring this point so much? Well, the integrated LUFS measurement is based on, as I've said, the whole of your track. What we're going to do this time is I'm going to do something to the arrangement of my track. And then what we're going to do is to watch what happens with our integrated LUFS measurements. I'm going to take the quietest moment that exists within this piece, which is this section here. And for a moment, what I'm going to do is to move my now slightly larger loudness meter out of the way. And I'm going to take this section back, not just to here, but in fact to 4 bars earlier than that, which is going to be bar 2. And I'm going to make it twice the length that it was before. All of these individual regions can be stretched. And the reason for that is because they're all coming in as audio files. So in other words, the sequences that created them in the first place from the live loops measurement can be stretched out. And what I've done on purpose is to make this slightly quieter section of the track now a more dominant feature of the track in terms of its overall length. We've discovered by me running the loudest bit that the integrated LUFS measurement is at roughly -11. In other words, 3 decibels too loud for Spotify. If I uploaded this track, Spotify would turn it down. But I don't really want Spotify to turn it down because I want this track to be loud and punchy and as big as it can be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reset this measurement, going to come out of pause and reset, and we're going to run it again. And this time, because I've got a section of the track which is quieter, which is taking up more of the overall portion of the track than it was before, I'm interested to know what the integrated LUFS measurement is going to be this time. Again, I'm going to press start. This time I'm going to run it the whole way through the entire track. What I want you to do is to notice what happens when we're in the quieter sections, not just at the beginning, but when this part comes back. Look what happens to the integrated LUFS measurement. I think we're going to start to get a bit of volume back every time we're in a section which is a little bit quieter. Now remember, I've adjusted nothing within Mastering Assistant, and yes, I know it's still too loud. That's an important thing for me to say. But previously, our integrated LUFS measurement was at -11. In other words, a whole decibel louder than it is now. And all I've done is to change the arrangement. I haven't changed anything to do with loudness. So this is telling us that if there are sections within our tracks that are quieter, what we're effectively doing is we're buying ourselves extra loudness for the sections that we want to have be loud. In other words, if I were to do two things, which is to move this section on the end back a bit, let's say another 4 bars, and if I extended this section out a little bit, so that again, it was 8 bars long, and maybe what I did was to dive back into Mastering Assistant and remember that I just simply pushed the loudness dial without thinking about it too hard. And maybe what we do is to take that back to 0, where we've still got a nice big loud mix, but we're not pushing things quite so hard. I wonder what that does now for our integrated measurement. In other words, what I'm trying to say is if you have dynamic range within your tracks where you have quiet sections, it means you're allowed louder sections. If your tracks just start loud and stay loud, all Spotify is going to do is to turn them down. And you might have noticed this. The really interesting is that film soundtracks and classical music sound amazing on Spotify because the loud bits are really loud. EDM doesn't sound so good most of the time because it starts with a whacking great kick drum and that stays in the whole way through and the track just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And every time an arrangement section comes along to make the track even bigger, track almost appears to get quieter. In other words, what we can do if we bring in more dynamic range is that our tracks can sound better on streaming services. It's almost like dynamic range is a good idea. Who knew? So once again, I'm going to just undo that. I'm going to reset it. And I have turned it down a little bit now, but let's see whether or not I could even potentially have more level now, depending on what that integrated measurement is. And by the way, yes, it doesn't matter that the momentary LUFS measurement and the short-term LUFS measurement go into the yellow, so long as the integrated one doesn't. I've actually got 0.7 of a dB extra volume to play with. I could come back into Mastering Assistant and actually begin to reintroduce some of this loudness if I really wanted it to be louder. I'm going to just make one point just to remind you, actually the Spotify algorithm would turn this track up a little bit because it could come up by 0.7 dB in terms of its integrated LUFS measurement. So if I don't do that, it's not a disaster, it's still going to be loud. Now, I don't know if this is true or not, but a lot of people used to make the point when she first emerged as an artist that some of the reason why Billie Eilish's stuff sounded so good on streaming services is because the tracks are amazingly dynamic. They often start with a really quiet intro section. That means when the chorus arrives, my word, it can be loud because she's bought herself all of that additional dynamic range. And as I've mentioned, she's by no means alone. Beethoven does that too, it turns out, if you upload his tracks to Spotify, because again, classical music has this incredible dynamic range and it sounds really good for the fact that the loud bits can be really loud. So obviously it goes without saying there are lots of things we can learn here. Dynamic range is a really important thing when it comes to music. I've always said you don't know what loud is unless you know what quiet is. So in other words, if everything's just loud, loud ceases to mean anything. The whole loudness wars when it came to mastering were ridiculous because there was no light and shade to that music. You don't know what left sounds like without right. You don't know what dark sounds like without bright. I'm writing lyrics now. or rapping in a kind of slow way. But nevertheless, the important thing is that the contrasts are really important. And the interesting thing is it turns out that technologically they are really important if we want to put our music into streaming services. It goes without saying as well that, of course, if you want to know more about the whole idea of how you can manage volume all the way through your projects, not just at the output stage, the volume management course, which is on learn.johnnybuchananmusic.com, might be a really interesting thing for you to dive deeper into. I've gone even further into LUFS management there, but also thinking about volume all the way through your tracks. So if you're interested, definitely go and have a look at that. That's part of the Essentials range of courses. But within this video, we've learned that dynamic range is really important, and we've learned how to manage it even if we work with plugins like Mastering Assistant.